honored to introduce Jonah McAllister Erickson, who is the scholarly communication librarian. So thank you, Jonah.
Thank you, Carrie. All right, well, let's just go ahead and jump into it. So today's presentation is on predatory publishing. I will briefly touch on some other academic scams, but really focus just on predatory publishing. And so today's objectives are to learn about sort of academic scams, avoiding them. We'll have time for Q&A, and then we also have some practice exercises, which are solicitation emails that I or colleagues of mine have received asking us to publish. Some of them are predatory and some of them are not, or at least some of them are questionable. So one thing I want to start with is defining what do I mean by predatory. And there are a number of different definitions that are out there. I like this one that was in a 2019 issue of Nature, sort of saying that predatory journals are those that prioritize self-interest over the sort of scholarship and scholarly record. Although I think it is worth noting that there is often a degree of tension between publishers and the scholarly community around profit motives, even with the big 5 publishers. So there have been several examples of, mass editorial board resignations because they disagree with the business decisions that their publisher is making. And that's not what I'm talking about here. It's more about, it's just a money-making operation. There's no sort of connected scholarly enterprise that predatory publishers are really involved in. And so the way I like to define predatory beyond sort of what they're saying in that Nature article is, it's a predatory offer that uses some kind of deceitful scheme to get some kind of benefit from scholars. And that's normally money, but it's not always money. And that's often an enticement to publish a book, a journal article, to attend or be a speaker at a conference, and to be a potential member of an editorial board. And why are they doing these things? Well, the number one reason is money. And so with predatory operations, right, their end goal is to make money. And sometimes they can make quite a bit of money. So one of the largest predatory publishers, the Onyx Group, which continues to function despite everybody knowing that they're a predatory operation. They rebrand their journals, change their names, but continue to function. They were taken to court by the Federal Trade Commission here in the US, and they were ordered to pay a $50.1 million judgment. That was based on their profits. So they're making quite a lot of money. Now that was over, many, many years, but still that is not an insignificant amount of money by any means. And that was, publishing research without doing any kind of peer review or any kind of the normal activities that you expect of a journal. Sometimes they're playing more of that long con kind of game, where they're setting up a journal with the objective of, say, getting it indexed in Scopus or Web of Science, right? Or just having it appear to be a more legitimate, well-established publication. And so they're soliciting you for content primarily, and not so much to charge you a fee for publishing or to make money in that way. So be aware of that. You want to make sure that, the kinds of journals you're publishing in may not always be just about the money. Now, normally they do charge you money, but it's like, not quite on that same scale. And that's also related to why often predatory publishers invite people to be part of their editorial boards or groups, is to help, boost their reputation. But if you become a member of their editorial board, you won't actually be asked to do any work, which is a big red flag. They also do have a tendency to just add scholars kind of at random, but it's usually somebody that's, somewhat prominent in the field, perhaps somebody who's already has a merit status, so they're perhaps not as engaged as they once were in the larger academic community. And that's one thing that you can do to check to see if a journal is legitimate, is looking at who is on their editorial board and verifying that, outside of just the journal's landing page. So there's those 3 sort of driving motors, but the content and reputation are really for the long-term goal of making money. And so if people would like to, we can take a moment and you can share some ideas in the chat about what predatory, when we say predatory, what does that mean to you? And we'll just, hold for a second or two, and then I'll go on with some additional thoughts I have on that. Okay, so not a super interactive group today, but that's all right. I wish it gave me, yes, very good, fake peer review. So when I say predatory, I also like to use the word scammy, right? It's, oh yeah, okay, great. Yep, but they're rolling in now. Thank you. Yeah, I think those are all great examples, right? No, not doing peer review, but saying you are doing peer review, right? Preying on more junior faculty and graduate students who need to publish to advance their career, perhaps even to finish their dissertation, they need to have a published journal article, or sometimes 3, right? Sometimes even after the money, Gordon, it's not even they don't do the peer review, it's they don't even talk to you anymore. Like they'll just put whatever you gave them on the website and they're good. Some other common scams I see are, concealing required fees until after acceptance. So any legitimate publisher is going to tell you up front, this is how much it's going to cost if there are fees associated with publishing. I have seen this several times with people who have fallen into the trap of submitting a paper to a predatory journal and then going, oh, shouldn't have done that. And they're requesting a fee to withdraw the article from consideration, like basically trying to hold that article hostage unless you pay them some usually fairly extravagant amount of money, similar to how much they would charge you in an article processing charge. Even going so far as to threaten to publish and then retract the article to have a sort of a negative mark on your record, which is that second point, threatening retraction unless you pay them a fee, right? Often predatory journals have invented metrics or exaggerated metrics. So you'll go there and a lot of people look for a particular impact factor. In fact, I was on a webinar with Taylor and Francis 2 weeks ago, and they were saying that some schools, for promotion and tenure purposes, can't publish in a journal that has a lower score than 4, an impact factor of 4. Well, some journals will then just say, well, okay, well, we have to have an impact factor of 4, so I'm putting that in there. Even if they do have an impact factor or a site score, like they're pumping it up. But more often than not, they just don't have any of those metrics at all, and they just sort of make them up. Lying about who's on the editorial board or who's a speaker at a conference, right? How they do peer review is conducted. And then I think the real hallmark of predatory publishing is that they do no peer review at all. So they will accept your article. It's never sent out for review. They just, in the end, they just want to get paid, whatever their fee is. And there are some things that can be concerning, but really context does matter about them. So asking authors to recommend peer reviewers for their own work is not common in many fields, but is in some. It's also common to ask for people you think shouldn't review your work. That's more common, and that's in part because sometimes there are, rivalries within the academic community or known sort of disputes, and you're like, I don't think this person should review my paper. That can be concerning, but it's not, context matters, right? Not having a peer review or editorial review policy on the journal can also be important. I'm glad this phone system, Zoom system, is working really well. Sorry about that. Now, I think that's concerning, but it really depends on what the nature of the publication is, particularly those that are focused on practitioners in the field instead of a more traditional academic journal, often don't have the same kind of editorial and peer review policies. Also, some journals are just not good at having their website updated, and so they do have those policies, but they haven't told you what they are. Reviewing articles in just a few days, I honestly would say this is almost always concerning, but sometimes there are circumstances where you're being specifically solicited for content, right? And it's a known actor and they're able to do the peer review relatively quickly. Sometimes they're just, very efficient operations. I would say anything less than a month for peer review is extremely suspect. And we all know that peer review often takes like 6 months, a year sometimes now, particularly post-COVID. But it also depends on what the nature of their peer review is, right? So if they're just doing editorial review, so only an editor at the journal is going to review the article, yeah, that could probably be done in a few days. That is not the same as double anonymous or triple anonymous peer review, right? And then a poor publication record. And what I mean by that is that they're inconsistent with how often they publish, right? So they have an issue and then there's a big gap. They have another issue, or articles come out and like they're doing the more continuous publication method, they're coming out, irregularly. Some things are common at both legitimate and predatory publishers. Having a name similar to another publication is endemic in academic publishing. There are at least 3 journals of field robotics that I'm aware of, all of them legitimate. One of them actually founded by the editorial board at the previous journal of field robotics that they worked on, and they got mad at their publisher and resigned en masse and started a journal with almost an identical name. Charging fees to authors is also very common, and publication fees have been around for a very long time. I'm sure everybody on this call is familiar with open access processing charges, but there are page charges, color charges. A friend of mine who's a neuroscientist once commented that they always knew what the really good neuroscience articles were going to be because they would be the ones with black and white images because they wouldn't pay the extra color image charges, right? So charging authors as part of the publication process has been a common practice. And then having a wide range of journals, some with lower quality standards, is very common in large publishing portfolios. But there are some predatory indicators in there. So a similar look and feel to an established journal, which is different than just having a similar name or a virtually identical name. That's just like a topic identifier. When they're copying the look and feel of another publication. So if I look at those 2 field robotics or 3 field robotics journals, right, each one of them has their own distinct branding sense of identity, right? They're not trying to clone each other. In fact, they're trying to say, no, we're different. We just are on the exactly same topic. Again, fake metrics, fake index listings is also really problematic. And these are some of the things that you can check to verify, is this a real publication? Are the things that they're presenting true? So they'll say things like, we're listed in EBSCO, ProQuest, Scopus, PubMed, right? A very, very wide list of number of acceptable topics, especially if they're not one of the known mega journals. So like PLOS One publishes on a very wide range of topics, but is well established, and we know PLOS One is not a scam. Unsolicited emails, missing standard numbers, so that's ISSNs or DOIs or other kinds of standard tracking numbers that publishers always want to get because it helps them monitor their own metrics, helps them get indexed places. If journals don't have an ISSN or they're not minting DOIs, right, that's a sign that something's off. No instructions for authors listed, also a big red flag. And then finally, again, I'll say this, but the promises of really fast peer review and publication are often red flags. Because peer review, publication, even just copy editing and formatting take time. And so if you're not seeing that sort of time-intensive activities, there's something off with what they're doing. There are also some really more advanced predatory activities. And that relates perhaps not to you being drawn into publishing in them, although I think hijack journals and hijack special issues can draw in people who don't realize that something has gone sideways with the journal. So a hijack journal is one where there's an existing journal and somebody takes over their web address, or there are still surprisingly journals that don't really have a web presence. They're continuing to do the print model. Those are usually very small society journals, so learned society journals, where they send out those print issues to their members as part of their membership dues. Somebody takes that over, creates a web presence, and solicits submissions to them. I don't have on this slide, but on the LibGuide I linked to, there is a list of known hijacked journals maintained by Retraction Watch, which is one of the only times I would suggest a list, since this is a known and documented activity. It also can happen to like recently discontinued titles, or when there's been a merged title. So something to look out for, and you want to make sure, you know, all right, this is really the journal I am publishing in. There's also something called publication laundering, where journals that may not be providing appropriate oversight for their issues are able to be infiltrated and subverted. This happened most prominently with a journal published by Elsevier that focused on conference proceedings for material science, where bad actors were setting up fake conferences, soliciting submissions to them, and then getting them published in that particular journal. And because the journal wasn't doing its due diligence, neither the editorial board nor the publisher, something like 5,000 fake conference proceedings were able to be published, like individual conference papers were able to be published in this journal at last count. So you can follow that link and read James Heather's full write-up on that. There's also issues where guest editors will hijack otherwise legitimate titles. So somebody says, hey, I want to do a special issue as a guest editor. And having worked in scholarly publishing for over a decade now, I have to say that working on a special issue as the primary editor, as the managing editor, is often as much, if not more work than doing a guest editor if you're actually providing the appropriate level of oversight. A journal I used to work on used to complain that they didn't want to accept guest editors or special issues because it didn't save them any labor. You know, they still did it because it was good for their colleagues, particularly for junior colleagues that were, you know, getting experience as being guest editors. But you'll have somebody sign up to be a guest editor, and then they will on the sly solicit submissions which they're not putting through for peer review. So, you know, the editor is acting in bad faith. And that's one of the places where maybe you can get caught up unknowingly, right? Because you're submitting to a special issue at an otherwise legitimate journal, and they are doing peer review for some of the submissions, but then there's just going to be this garbage that gets published alongside your work. Just something to be aware of. Now, fortunately, if you suspect that's happened, you can contact the publisher or the main editor, managing editor for the journal and say, you know, I think that there's a problem with some of the content that's been published in this issue. You need to fix this. But it is something that happened. And then there's also just where people get their paper accepted and then they sell authorships for it. So, you know, hey, I've got a, you know, journal article accepted into, you know, the middling journal of, you know, osteopathic medicine, and I can add a couple of co-authors if you want to pay me, you know, so selling authors that way. For some reason, Facebook Marketplace seems to be the preferred go-to venue for these kinds of transactions, at least the last time I looked into it. And that does happen. And that's one of the reasons a lot of journals are now cracking down on authorship changes after submission or during the peer review process. Do we have a question? Okay. Now, this is not directly a predatory publishing activity, but it's connected to that kind of fraudulent activity, and that's paper mills, which produce fraudulently, occasionally just merely bad, but usually just completely fake articles on commission, and or they're selling authorships to those things. So they've worked with a corrupted editor, or they just do a lot of submissions and then they sell authorships to these fake or merely very bad articles. There's a really great write-up on this in PNAS, which I've got linked on this slide. And I think this is a really increasing problem. It's not so much a problem for you as an author attempting to submit your own work, but it really is corrupting the sort of overall body of scientific literature. And one of the charts from this article is showing just the really rapid increase in paper mill production. Now, a lot of this predates, you know, the rise of large language models, but since large language models have come onto, you know, the scene, we're seeing just a greater proliferation of just completely falsified articles that are being able to be put out on scale. So it's something to be aware of, particularly if you're the kind of researcher that's doing like a meta-analysis or systematic review. There may be a lot of really like completely falsified research that you're going to encounter and have to sort of wade through. On an individual level, I don't think it's that big of a crisis because you're going to be reading those articles, and as a expert in your field, you'll recognize fairly quickly, oh, this article doesn't make any sense, or there's some big systematic flaws. But when you're trying to do that big meta-analysis, some of those things eke in. But that is a problem. And paper mills target both predatory publishers, right? Because people just need a publication, but they also tend to target legitimate publishers or legitimate journals at a higher rate because they don't want to have that, so that they don't want to pay another predatory actor that ekes into their profit margin. Something just to be aware of and have on your horizon. Yes, and because there's an incentive to appearing in some of these journals, they tend to work to subvert editors to get works into indexed works. So be aware of that. I think it's also important to note that quality, prestige, and impact are different kinds of metrics and things to be concerned about and aware of than predatory activity. It's very easy to conflate questions about quality with predatory activity. So there are lots of journals that are not those highly selective publishers that they're still doing peer review, they're still putting out good research, right? It's just not on the same level of prestige and perhaps selectiveness that we see with some. So there's something like 50,000 active academic journals right now. Might be as few as 30, as high as 50. It's one of those things that it really bothers me that we can't figure out exactly how many academic journals are out there. Not that I'm working on figuring that problem out, but somebody else should be doing that, right? And there's something like 2 million journal articles published every year, which is just an absolutely massive amount of content, right? And if we think about some of those really prestigious titles, so Nature, they're accepting 7% was the last time I checked, sub 10% every year, right? New England Journal of Medicine is at around 5%. Science is 6.1, right? Collectively, they're only publishing around 3,000 articles a year, right? Across those three highly selective titles, right? So that's, a tiny percentage of the overall publication activity. And so, just because a journal doesn't have a high impact factor or, is publishing some works that aren't particularly good, right, does not mean that they're not a legitimate journal. They're not engaging in that scammy activity. They're just in a different place overall in the market, right, for journals. Everybody can't be in that first quartile of journals. Otherwise, we would have very fewer journals and, it would be a much more cutthroat publish or perish kind of situation. They would also, there are some incentives that are negative for publishing in Nature, like, you need to have a very fancy cutting edge, new exciting results that often lead to bad science in a different way. Talk for another time though. So just be aware of that. There are journals across a wide spectrum of how I would describe quality, right? And I think it's also important to recognize that money and publishing really are connected, even with those big prominent publishers that are household names: Elsevier, Springer, Nature, Wiley. All those publishers are in the business of making money. They just happen to be in the business of making money by publishing scholarly materials. And sometimes they have other money-making ventures. So Elsevier is owned by a company called the Relics Group, right? They don't. Not only are they one of the largest academic publishers in the world, they also sell information about people, which is they call their risk solutions group. And so, which is connected to some of their publishing activity. But, they're a big diversified multinational corporation. Publishing is just one part of it. And charging fees has been a longstanding activity, not related to predatory publishing and not necessarily related to open access. So again, there's the color image, page charges, indexing fees, and more recently, those open access charges have been with us for a long time. So being asked to pay as part of the publishing process, not uncommon, has been common, since at least the 1970s. And I think it's worth also saying that predatory publishing is not an open access problem. It's really an issue with the internet because it now the barrier to creating a new journal is a lot lower than it once was, and that fees have always been charged. You can, spin up a journal, have a website, accept submissions and payments online. So you can be anywhere in the world, right? You're no longer having to, print physical volumes and distribute them, like, just a very low barrier to entry, which is also why we've seen an explosion of journal titles, because, any interested faculty member essentially can start their own journal as long as they know how to, spin up a website or pay somebody else to create the website for them. It's unfortunate that the open access movement and predatory publishing have come up together in some ways, because one of the things that made open access possible is that it removed a lot of those cost barriers to making scholarly works freely available. So let's talk about avoiding scams. And some of it is I know it when I see it, right? Unfortunately, So one thing I always suggest is your network, right? When you're thinking about where to publish, or is this a legitimate opportunity, who is in your network? Do colleagues, or do you have connections to a conference, a journal, a publisher, right? You want to confirm those connections independently. So, just because somebody's name in the field and they're listed on the editorial board, check to make sure they're listing that on their LinkedIn or on their faculty profile website, right? Check in with a colleague, right? Now, it's important to know that, that can enter a certain level of bias into your venue selection, but that's definitely the safest route in terms of like knowing that different publication opportunities are genuine, right? There's also the advice I often give to graduate students is like, what journals are you reading in your field right now, right? What conferences are you attending, or what conferences does your, advisor, mentor attend? Those are the kinds of venues you should be targeting, And, if you're very new to the field, what are some of the journals that your colleagues regularly consult, right? Sort of, again, leveraging that network and saying, okay, well, these are the things we're reading or interacting with. Those are the venues I should select. Now, that does raise a challenge, because if everybody's only reading, journals that are in that top quartile of publications, and you're a brand new, graduate student trying to publish your first paper, maybe look at related journals by the same publishers that have lower rankings, lower metrics, right? And probably better acceptance rates. I forgot to mention this, most journals that are legitimate will also list what their acceptance rate is somewhere on their website. They usually don't put it right up front. The average acceptance rate for non-highly selective journals is between 30 and 40%. Now, there are some checklists or other resources, and the one I use is suggest to people think, check, submit, which is a good resource, but it does have some limitations. One is you only want to use it as a guide. It's not like a definitive thing. All right, I've gone through the checklist. Yes, no, you still need to use your common sense. It has a bias towards big publishers. That means it's also biased against newer journals and newer publishers. And it's also biased against newer forms of scholarship or interdisciplinary efforts, right? And you still need to use your own common sense. The way it biases towards bigger or well-established publishers, right, is it asks questions like, is the publisher a member of a recognized industry initiative or group, right? And that's often something that, only well-established publishers can afford to join. And it now includes some examples of publishers outside the US and Europe, but it also tends to be fairly heavily, North America, Western Europe centric. I do have a list of some third world or developing countries publishing groups, societies, lists of that you can consult on the LibGuide. I also don't generally recommend lists. So checklists, yes. Lists of predatory publishers, no. Other than the hijacked journals list, so there is a product, Cabell's Predatory Reports, which WVU does not subscribe to, and it's not commonly subscribed to by other R1s and not any of the other R1s in our region. So Penn State, Pitt, CMU don't subscribe to that product either. There's Beal's List, which is fairly well known. It was discontinued in 2017, so it's way out of date now. But Jeffrey had unclear criteria for inclusion, and he often included legitimate publishers and journals from non-English speaking worlds. And that actually included a journal that I used to work on that was published at the University of Pittsburgh library. And as far as we could tell, the only reason it was included on Beall's list is because the founding editor was a Colombian who was a medical student, MD, PhD candidate at that time at the University of Pittsburgh. And it's a journal targeted towards new medical school graduates, practicing physicians. So it's sort of a niche thing, but we couldn't figure out, like, it's on the list, and you know, it was just a mystery to us, other than, yeah, it's got a foreign national as the managing editor, and it accepts the articles have to have an abstract in English, but it did accept articles in Spanish. Some of the problems with checklists are, you know, since the barrier to entry is real low, as soon as something appears on a list, often if it's a truly predatory activity, they've just reskinned the journal and they're continuing to, you know, rake in the profits. The more sophisticated operations are able to evade detection. And then there's new kinds of scams that are, you know, regularly coming up. So it's, you know, it's like, if you're relying on the list as saying, you know, all right, well, it's not on this list, I'm good to go, you know, we still need to evaluate it. So I think, you know, doing that kind of evaluation and checking it is really more important. So one of the things I always suggest is that you want to verify what the journal claims. So if they have those metrics, impact factors, site score, they say I'm indexed in PubMed or PubMed Central or Medline, you can look up those lists and say, all right, is this journal actually indexed in the resource they're claiming to? Does their impact factor match what's on their website? You can also verify that publishers are members of different professional associations. So two that are very important, the Committee on Publication Ethics, which is COPE, and then the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors are two definite signs of quality. Now, again, that's for more established titles, but if somebody says I'm a member of COPE and they're not, that's a huge flag that something's off. Same thing with ICMJE, right? You know, and those are all places where you can verify who are members of those organizations, which titles are included. And then there are some other, you know, open access Scholarly Publishing Association, the Associated University Press Library Publishing Coalition are all resources that you check. And those are just, you know, the ones that were off the top of my head when I was creating the LibGuide. There are many others. So if there's a claim on the website, I would take the time to verify it. There are some common traps, you know, so, you know, respected scholars on the editorial board or listed as giving a conference keynote, right? You want to verify that that's actually true, independent of the look. The better or more sophisticated scams will have a familiar publishing company name that sounds a lot like, you know, something you've already heard of, but it's not quite that. So be aware of that. And then, you know, it's very rare that there are last minute requests because, you know, somebody dropped out or, you know, has withdrawn a paper and, you know, they need more content, right? Legitimate publishers will just go forward with what they've got on hand instead of trying to backfill it with some last minute solicitations. So let's go into some food for thought. You know, how would you handle the following situations and advise colleagues to handle it? You're reviewing somebody's dossier for promotion and tenure and suspect one of their publications was with a predatory publisher or journal, right? And you can put this in the chat or folks can unmute. So I think what I would do is I would urge you to look at the quality of that publication. I would flag that for them. Yeah, I think that would be a good answer. Yeah, you could ask them to come and speak to me. You know, I think that, you know, this is something that can happen, right? But I would always urge people to evaluate the scholarship on its own, even if it happens to be published in a less prestigious or perhaps predatory journal, right? This does happen every once in a while, and you know, we just saw this happen where a journal a colleague of mine is published in was sold to a third-party company, new publishing house, and it seems to now be engaging in predatory behavior. This seemed to be one of those deals where they got themselves indexed in Scopus and Web of Science, and then somebody was like, oh, they want to buy it, I'll sell it, and now that the people who bought it are trying to recoup the sales costs plus make extra money. But because it's in Scopus and Web of Science, it's got that sort of cachet. What would you do if that's happened, And my thoughts, I would start talking about how this thing has been subverted, what's going on with this publisher, and saying it used to be quality and now something else has gone wrong. And I would probably talk about that if I was going to include an article like in my tenure and promotion packet. I would flag that for potential readers. That this thing has gone sideways since I published in it, which does happen, right? And I've seen this happen to several people. They've already committed to publish in a journal, or they're agree to speak at a conference, and then everything seems hinky after they're sort of already taken a few steps in that direction. And what I generally say to people is that they should back out, withdraw their paper, and if you're being threatened with some kind of retaliation, note that you're willing to share that publicly, even if it's a little embarrassing. So again, if you think you have been scammed or are being scammed, you can always reach out to me or contact the WVU Ask a Librarian service. And I think you should always treat colleagues with compassion and empathy, right? Some of these scams can be incredibly hard to detect and sophisticated. So it's not always immediately apparent, what's going on, particularly with hijacked special issues or those hijacked journals, things where all appearances on the surface really are legitimate, and this was or is normally an above board operation. I've got some suggested readings here, and then I've got a few emails that we can take a look at for solicitations that we've received. So if folks have any questions, I'll pause for a moment here for any questions that people might have. Otherwise, we can plow through with some of the email solicitations. That last one, authorship for sale, papers for sale, everything for sale, that is where somebody's documented that that's a Facebook marketplace activity. And the other ones just go over some standard activities that we've seen. Well, I counted to 10 in my head. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of these practice questions. Now, often I do this with a poll, but I forgot to talk to Jody and Carrie about having a poll for these, but yes, no. So just give me a react if you're still here with us. So, so like email solicitation 1, we invite you to submit your manuscript to email address for publications. Our objective is to inform authors of the decision on their manuscript within 24 hours. Following acceptance of paper will be published in the current issue. Does this seem like a genuine offer from an upstanding publication? Yep, we're seeing no. Yep, everybody's right on. Yeah, no, absolutely. This is very, very suspect. And I also would say one thing I've also seen is with solicitations, if it's coming from not from an institutional account, not like a university account, but like most journals will have, at science.org or at science.edu, from their journal instance, not a Gmail account or, et cetera. Even if Google is the back end of what they're doing, it's not a Gmail account, it's an institutional email. So that's also something to be on the lookout for. Yeah, this one, not a real solicitation. Here's another one. Good morning. We're glad to inform you that we are in deficit of articles for fruitful release for our January edition. Is it possible to support us with any research in your field? And This is one of those classic traps, right? We don't have, enough content for our upcoming issue. I mean, yeah. All right, so here we have another one. Dear full name, I saw your research this morning, very interesting, and I just wanted to suggest where to send it. Our journal is an overlay journal hosted by an academic platform and is free of charge for both authors and readers. What do people think about this one? And yes, Shannon, I think you're right on. I don't think that this is necessarily a scam. I think it feels a little awkward. Now that they're not charging fees to authors or readers, right, is a good sign that it's not at least that scam that's just trying to make a buck off of you of an author. Might be part of a long con. More likely than not, it's a new journal with perhaps an inexperienced editor that's trying to drum up solicitations, right? It's a little awkward, but I don't think it's probably not predatory. And this one is a big wall of text, so I'll give everybody a minute to read it. But basically, hey, we've got a publication. We take lots of different kinds of potential content, including thesis, things that appeared in your thesis, right? And we give you certain kinds of opportunities to distribute your work. And just in the yes, fake. Yeah, I think this one is, well, it's problematic. And what this actually is a solicitation from a vanity press. So when they send you the detailed brochure and get more information, right? It's a publishing house that promises you publications. They're not doing any peer review. They're not actually claiming to do peer review or any kind of review. They'll take pretty much any content and dress it up. And it's one of these sort of unusual operations where they're not necessarily charging you fees directly, although they will offer you things that they will do for a fee, like, copy editing and some additional formatting. But really where they're making money is by selling copies of your work on Amazon or eBooks, which you're not going to get the revenue from. But if you needed something that's peer reviewed as part of your, promotion packet or, just your annual review, this is not a route to do that, right? Because they will publish anything, make it look nice, but it is not doing that peer review or any kind of scholarly evaluation. And I believe this is the last one. So the journal name redacted is a biannual published in spring and fall. It's a peer-reviewed open access publication for original articles, reviews, and case studies. The journal welcomes original research and practitioner experience papers, as well as submissions in alternative formats in order to lower the barrier to publication for authors. The journal does not charge submissions or any other form of author fee. Copyright in the articles will remain with the authors, and the articles will be published under a CC license, and that's Creative Commons. And this one is a genuine solicitation email from a real journal. It's an open access journal. It has a relatively small scope, so original research, practitioner experience, and it's a journal that's trying to, expand the formats of scholarship. So perhaps it's not just looking for a traditional journal article, but other kinds of publication experiences or ways to tell stories. This is not for this particular title, but I know like some submissions I've seen recently that are really interesting. There was one about school readiness, which had parents talk about what it meant to get ready for school and included them taking pictures of what that meant. But it's not a traditional journal article, like, you know, from a strictly academic perspective, you know, where it's like, here was the study we did, or, you know, here's the sort of notes from the field. It was like, let's talk to parents about what this means and have the parents sort of drive the journal article. I think that's what they mean by alternative formats, if I'm remembering which journal this is from. And that's what I've got for content. Open for questions. We've got about 10 minutes left in the hour. Always welcome for email. I've got my phone number there. You can in the future call me during any Zoom meeting and see you pop up in the corner there. And I also, you can always schedule an appointment with me using the library's appointment scheduler.
While everybody takes a moment to think to see if they have any last minute questions for Jonah, I'll take advantage of the downtime and thank you again, Jonah, for presenting for us once again on a very important and very timely topic here, that truly impacts a lot of our investigators. Thank you to everyone for joining us on your Monday afternoon. Our next fact session is in 2 weeks, two Mondays from now on October 27th. And we will be talking about the responsible AI use in research. So if you are not registered for that one yet and you are interested, you should be able to find us. But if you need that registration link or a flyer again, you certainly can reach out to Jody Saunders or myself. But I will pause now after thanking everybody and see if there are any questions for Jonah.
And if there's no questions, I just wanted to plug again the LibGuide about predatory publishing. It goes over much of the same material I just covered with today's slides, and it also has my contact information as well as links to all of those resources. And this lovely graphic that I absolutely did not create about phony versus legitimate, which is pretty good. And I will stop sharing my slides, but thank you so much, everybody, for coming.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful Monday. Again, thank you, Jonah, and we'll see everybody at a previous section.